Hey everyone, and welcome to another deep dive. Today we're doing something really cool. You're diving into the work of Claudia Goldin.
A remarkable economist, just won the 2023 Nobel Prize.
Yeah, it's a really big deal. And her work, it focuses on women in the labor market going back like over 200 years of economic history. Get ready to uncover why women's participation in the workforce, well, it's not as straightforward as it might seem.
Not at all, no. It's
Yeah.
a fascinating journey.
So, okay, let's set the stage. Logically, you would think that as economies grow, more women would be working, right? It's like more opportunities, more women in the workforce. Seems pretty simple.
Right, yeah, it seems intuitive.
Exactly. But Claudia Goldin's research, it reveals this really surprising pattern. A U-shaped curve of women's labor force participation.
Yeah, that's one of her big discoveries. It challenges like the very assumptions we have about economic growth and women's roles and all that.
Okay, so a U-shaped curve, tell me more about this. What does that even mean?
So Goldin, she went way back to like the 18th century and dove into these old historical records.
Oh.
And she found something really interesting. A higher percentage of women were actually working before industrialization.
Wait, really? More women working on farms and compared to factories and stuff during the Industrial Revolution?
Exactly. A lot of women working early on, then it dips during industrialization, and then it goes back up again later. That's the curve.
Wow. Okay. That completely changes how we view women in the 18th century. But it seems counterintuitive. Why were more women working back then?
Well, think about the work itself. Before factories, it was all about the home. Family farms, these small businesses, cottage industries, women. They were essential to all of that.
Right. Yeah. Their work was how families survived, basically.
Exactly.
But then as work shifted away from the home into factories and things.
Right. And factory work, physical strength, stamina that was seen as men's work. Right. And on top of that, all these social norms saying women should be at home, it all played a role.
Yeah. And, we have to think about how historical data, maybe it didn't even fully capture all the work women were doing in the first place.
Oh, absolutely. If you think about how they recorded things back then, wife wasn't a job title.
Yeah.
But those women, they were often the backbone of their households. They were involved in the family businesses, even if it wasn't official.
It's true.
Goldin had to get creative to find their stories.
Like an economic detective.
In a way.
So how did she do it? Fill in those missing pieces.
Well, take 18th century Philadelphia, for example.
Yeah.
They had these directories, right? And she used those to track female-headed households.
Oh, interesting.
Yeah, these directories were like her treasure map. They gave her a way to piece together a much clearer picture of what women were doing, economically speaking.
That's so cool, using these old directories to, get a glimpse into these women's lives. It's fascinating.
It is, and it highlights how important it is to really look at the sources and, challenge the assumptions we make about the past.
Definitely. Makes you wonder what other stories are hidden in those old records. But, getting back to this U-shaped curve thing, we see it's not as simple as economy grows, more women work.
No, not at all. It's way more complex.
It's about these societal expectations, right? Cultural norms, even laws that directly impacted women's choices.
Right. Understanding the constraints women faced and how all of that influenced their decisions about work.
So we've got these hidden stories, these unexpected patterns, and what were some of those specific constraints women faced back then? Things that might seem unbelievable now.
Well, imagine, right, being told you couldn't work just because you got married.
Seriously. Actual laws against that.
Oh, yeah. Marriage bars, they were called.
Yeah.
Huge barrier, especially for women who wanted to be teachers or work in offices.
Wow.
It just reinforced this whole idea that, a woman's place is in the home, no matter what, regardless of her skills or anything.
Wow. Talk about a different world. It makes you realize how far we've come, but also how much those old ways of thinking still kind of linger,
Oh, absolutely. And that's where Goldin's cohort approach is so fascinating. Instead of looking at women as this one big group, she looked at the different generations as they were entering the workforce.
Right. I remember reading about that and comparing those generations, it revealed some interesting stuff, right?
Yeah, exactly. Women's expectations about work were often based on their mother's experiences. But those expectations didn't always match up with reality.
So, if their moms mostly stayed home, they thought they would too, even if that's not how things were actually playing out.
That's it. Think about it. Women entering the workforce in, say, the mid-20th century versus, the 1970s. Totally different worlds. Their mothers had lived such different lives.
Oh, that's a really good point. The 70s, with feminism and all that, more women going to work, it was a different world for them compared to their mothers, for sure.
Completely.
Mm.
And you see that in their choices. Those earlier generations, they often underestimated how long they'd actually be working, figured it was a quick stint before marriage and kids took over.
So they maybe didn't go to college, didn't even consider certain jobs because they figured, what's the point? I'll be married with kids soon enough.
Exactly. Making choices on a future that, in many cases, never actually happened. And that had huge implications, right? Like their earning potential, what careers they could even pursue.
It's like this domino effect, Choices made early on based on these expectations that might not even be true, and it just kind of ripples throughout their entire lives.
Totally. And then enter the birth control pill.
Right. Huge. I mean, you can't talk about women in the workforce without talking about the pill.
It's not an exaggeration to say it was like seismic.
Yeah.
For women's lives, period. And Goldin shows that in the economic data, too. This was the first time women had a real, reliable way to, plan their futures, control their fertility.
I know. It's hard to even imagine now, but back then, that was revolutionary to have that kind of control.
Totally. And it shifted those expectations we were just talking about. Suddenly, investing in your education, going after a serious career, it wasn't just some far-off possibility. It was something women could actually plan for.
And we see that, right? More women going to college, breaking into these fields that used to be all men.
Exactly. It was like this huge catalyst for social and economic change.
So we've seen this huge shift, right? With the pill, more women getting educated, going after those big careers.
Right.
You'd think that earnings gap would be gone by now, right? Like we're all equal, we're all in the workforce.
Yeah, you'd think so.
Yeah.
It's the question, though, isn't it? The one that everyone's trying to figure out, economists, sociologists, everybody. Why, with all this progress, is there still a gap? It's like we're missing something.
Well, it's the parenthood thing, isn't it? I mean, that seems to be like this big fork in the road for a lot of people. Men and women, their careers, their earnings, it's like everything kind of diverges when kids come along.
Exactly. Goldin calls it the parenthood effect. And it's really where her research is, I think, most insightful. This idea that these earnings differences, they often show up, or at least really widen, after that first kid arrives.
Which, I mean, that just tracks with what a lot of people see in their own lives, right?
Oh, totally.
Yeah.
And one of the clearest examples comes from her study on MBA graduates.
Okay, right. The MBA study, yeah.
So at first, right out of business school, men and women are earning pretty much the same.
Makes sense.
But then parenthood hits, and bam, the gap widens like crazy.
Okay, so what's the deal there? Help us understand why this is still happening.
Well, it's complicated, but Goldin links it to, I think, the demands we see in a lot of workplaces today.
Yeah.
This whole always-on culture. You got to be available 24/7. Flexibility is almost seen as a bad thing.
Oh, totally, yeah. It's like hustle culture, always got to be glued to your phone, answering emails at all hours.
Exactly. And that's where this idea of compensating differentials comes in. So those jobs, the ones that demand you're always available, where FaceTime is everything, they often pay more.
It's like a premium you get for being chained to your desk, basically, for having zero boundaries.
Basically, yeah. And that, of course, often puts women at a disadvantage, especially moms. I mean, even when both parents work, there's still this expectation that, mom's going to be the one to leave early for a school pickup or take a day if a kid's sick.
Right. It's like that's just the default, even now.
Yeah, unfortunately. So you have this system where the very jobs that punish you, in a way, for needing flexibility, for having a life outside of work, are often the highest paying.
So it's this impossible choice, right? Especially for women who are trying to make it all work, career, and family.
Yeah, and it's tough because it's not even always intentional. It's not like these companies are setting out to hold women back. It's more like the system that's been in place for so long, and it just naturally advantages some people over others.
So it's not even enough to just say, okay, we need equal pay for equal work anymore.
Right.
It's bigger than that now, right? It's like the structure of work itself, how we've set up these systems, that's often what's disadvantaging women, even if we don't mean for it to.
Exactly. And that's what I think makes Claudia Goldin's work so important, so relevant today. She's not just presenting the data, she's forcing us to confront these really uncomfortable truths about, why we haven't achieved true gender equality even now.
So if we were going to boil all this down, what's the one big takeaway for our listeners about Goldin's work?
I'd say it's this. Achieving equality, it's not about just checking boxes or hitting some finish line and saying, okay, we're done. It's a process, right?
Yeah.
Like, we're always going to be working towards it. And part of that is understanding how all these pieces fit together, the economics, the social norms, the choices people make.
It's about seeing those barriers that often aren't obvious, that we don't even realize are there, and figuring out how to break them down.
Absolutely. It's about shifting those expectations we were talking about earlier so that wanting both, a career and a family, it doesn't automatically put women at a disadvantage.
It's a challenge for sure, but I think it's something we can all be more aware of, like in our own workplaces and our own lives.
I think so too.
Well, that's a great note to end on. So to our listeners, if you really want to dive into this more, check out Claudia Goldin's work. It's fascinating. It'll make you think, and who knows, maybe even inspire some change.
I hope so.
Until next time, keep diving deep.